How did Wong Kar-wai go from this to this to this? Over a 25-year period between 1988 and 2013, Wong Kar-wai honed his distinct visual style with the help of an eclectic team of collaborators. In this video, I will outline the progression of Kar-wai's career over the course of his first 5 features between 1988 and 1995. This is the first part in a 2-part series. In the next episode, I will cover the rest of his career from 1997 to 2013. Born in Shanghai in 1958, Kar-wai moved to Hong Kong in 1963 when he was 5 years old. His experience growing up in Hong Kong during this period influenced his aesthetic in some of his later works, particularly in his so-called love trilogy, which includes Days of Being Wild, In the Mood for Love, and 2046, all of which are set in the 1960s. His first film, As Tears Go By, was released in 1988 and stars Andy Lau and Maggie Cheung, the latter of which would go on to become the most iconic actress associated with Kar-wai, working with him on a further 4 films up until 2004 with the release of 2046. Prior to this point, Kar-wai was only known as a writer of movies and is credited with having contributed to 10 screenplays between 1982 and 1987. By 1987, the film industry in Hong Kong was reaching its peak, and Kar-wai was invited to direct a picture for the company In Gear, which had been founded that year by the actor Alan Tang. Tang and Kar-wai were close, and as a result he was given considerable freedom to direct his debut feature. As Tears Go By is a gangster film in the vein of John Woo's A Better Tomorrow, which had been released 2 years prior to critical and commercial acclaim in 1986. Upon its release, the film proved popular with audiences and was well received with critics for the most part, establishing Kar-wai as an up-and-coming director in the Hong Kong New Wave. Notably, As Tears Go By was shot by Andrew Lau, who later went on to co-direct perhaps the most famous Hong Kong gangster film, 2002's Infernal Affairs. This film later went on to be adapted by Martin Scorsese into The Departed, which won Best Picture at the 79th Academy Awards in 2007. Kar-wai has only worked with 4 cinematographers over his 11 feature films. Lau may have been the first, but he is not the most important, and it would be a further 2 years until Kar-wai met the man who would prove to be the most influential on his style. Christopher Doyle was born in 1952 in Australia and moved to Hong Kong in the 1970s. He is known in Hong Kong as Du Ho Feng. By 1990, Doyle was an established cinematographer, having worked on 5 feature films, most notably Edward Yang's 1983 debut feature That Day on the Beach, which is often cited as the first film in the Taiwanese New Wave. Doyle first worked with Wong Kar-wai on his 1990 sophomore feature Days of Being Wild. Doyle's influence on Kar-wai's distinctive visual style is considerable, and the two went on to hone this aesthetic over the next 14 years, in which Kar-wai released a further 7 films, all of which were shot by Doyle. Days of Being Wild is the first part in Kar-wai's so-called love trilogy, but it would not receive a follow-up for another 9 years. In that time, Kar-wai released 4 more films, the first of which would mark perhaps his most audacious aesthetic leap yet. Days of Being Wild is notable in that it is a period piece. Set in the 1960s, the film set the precedent for some of Kar-wai's later, more distinctive work, such as In the Mood for Love and 2046, the 2 other films in the love trilogy. It stars Leslie Cheung and Andy Lau, as well as Maggie Cheung in her second role for Kar-wai, and Tony Leung in a brief cameo appearance. It is this cameo that not only went on to indirectly influence In the Mood for Love, establishing this film as the first part of the love trilogy, but also marked the first time that Leung worked with Kar-wai. Like his co-star Maggie Cheung, Tony Leung is perhaps the most iconic actor associated with Wong Kar-wai, having worked with him on 7 of his 11 films. But in spite of this, Days of Being Wild is ultimately most notable as the first time that Kar-wai and Doyle worked together, as it is this partnership that would go on to define not only the later work of Kar-wai, but the entire Hong Kong New Wave and its relationship to cinema at large. Kar-wai burst onto the screens again in 1994 with Chungking Express. It's easy to see why it was this film that established him as not only one of the most distinctive voices in Asian cinema, but also as a definitive director of the Hong Kong New Wave. Chungking Express is notable for its bifurcated structure, which follows 2 sets of characters over a narrative that is split down the middle. Its audacious aesthetic was conceived by Kar-wai with the help of both Andrew Lau and Christopher Doyle, who shot the first and second segments of the film respectively. This marks the only time in Kar-wai's filmography that he has used more than one cinematographer on a film. The opening of Chungking Express, which was shot by Andrew Lau, features perhaps the best example of the process of step printing in Kar-wai's filmography. Kar-wai would go on to reuse this technique in some of his later works, and it became synonymous with his visual style as years went on, to the point where it is still used today, such as in Everything Everywhere All at Once, as a shorthand for his aesthetic. Kar-wai would go on to reuse both this technique as well as a bifurcated structure in Fallen Angels, a sort of spiritual successor to Chungking Express released in 1995. Prior to the release of Fallen Angels, Kar-wai released Ashes of Time, an eclectic wuxia film inspired by characters from the Chinese novel The Legend of Condor Heroes, written by Jing Yong. Kar-wai founded his own production company, Jet Tone Films, in 1991 in anticipation of the release of this film. As a result, Ashes of Time was intended to be a commercial venture to help establish the studio, as wuxia films were popular across Asia at the time. Ashes of Time was also shot by Doyle, and like Chungking Express also features step printing. It uses this technique in some of its fight scenes to accentuate the movement of its characters. We can see a similar technique in later wuxia films, such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Hero, which both use wires in their fight scenes to make it appear as if their characters were flying. However, with the exception of its use of step printing, Ashes of Time is not a significant step forward in Kar-wai's aesthetic, and tends to be considered both a critical and commercial misstep that left Kar-wai exhausted. Kar-wai shot Chungking Express during a 2-month break in the shooting of Ashes of Time. This marked the first time that he took to making a film spontaneously, shooting without a script with only a vague idea of its plot and themes. Kar-wai later adopted a similar approach in shooting some of his later works, which I will discuss in more depth in the next episode. Chungking Express was shot and completed within only 6 weeks, and ended up being released a whole 2 months prior to Ashes of Time. It was a critical and commercial success, which gave Kar-wai the confidence he needed to make Fallen Angels, which was inspired by a story about a lovelorn hitman that Kar-wai conceived for Chungking Express, but then had to scrap due to production constraints. Fallen Angels is Kar-wai's most audacious work in many respects, and nowhere is this more apparent than in its aesthetic. Doyle used a wide-angle lens for many scenes, and this distorted perspective comes to characterize most of the film. Further to this, Kar-wai also opted to use step printing once again, alongside switching between color and black and white. You can see all 3 of these techniques used in this sequence, which stands out as one of the most distinct in Kar-wai's career. It's easy to see just how far Kar-wai progressed as a director over the course of his first 5 features when you compare this scene to a similar one from his debut, As Tears Go By. In just over 7 years, with the help of his cast of collaborators, Kar-wai went from a 2-bit scriptwriter to the most distinctive director working in Asia, an accolade which he held for at least the next 10 years. Join me in the next episode as I trace Kar-wai's development over his next 6 features, up until the modern day.